Absolutely no politician, and no political party, can in any way help the Aboriginal people declared colored of the Constitutional Act 30 of 1950. The Constitution protects the colored people and their land, under the Colored Persons Communal Reserve Trust Land Territory Act 3 of 1961, and Section 25 in the Constitution. Stay tuned so we can explain why and how we are protected in the Constitution of South Africa. Welcome to the South African Aboriginal Congress. Political parties and politicians are both governed and limited by unconstitutional and illegal policies, legislation and electoral systems they created, is to empower and protect themselves. These illegal laws and policies are enforced on the South African Aboriginal people declared colored, often by their own people as politicians and law enforcement employees. These illegal laws, policies, and electoral acts politicians created to protect themselves, is an affectation that allows foreign nationals to recognize these illegal laws and policies, to dispossess the South African colored people of South Africa's land and resource rights. This translates into fraud, theft, and gross human rights violations. The South African colored people's land and resource rights are currently under an illegally elected president, electoral system, and municipalities, driven and administered by political parties as politicians. References of these violations can be found in constitutional court judgments on land tenure, land reform, and electoral acts of 1993, 2004, and 2013. Most incriminating and damning is the 2018 ConCourt judgment, declaring the Independent Electoral Commission system unconstitutional and illegal, as well as the 2019 judgment, that is very specific on how the Land Tenure Acts including the Tran-CAT, is illegal and unconstitutional. Let us simplify this for you. The current ANC-led nationalist government, legislators, parliament, National Assembly, national prosecution agencies and municipalities are currently all in contempt of court. These currently unconstitutional and illegally elected political parties and politicians, often the colored's own people as politicians, are promoting and protecting the ANC government and the other policy-based parties they are voluntary part of, for financial gain. They call this stipend their salary. By doing so, politicians has cunningly and illegally maintained the administration to your colored persons' communal reserves trust land and resource rights, as per Act 3 of 1961. Let's start with why. Their primary drive is to enrich themselves and alienate you, the Aboriginal people of South Africa declared colored from your land rights, mining rights, petroleum rights, agriculture rights, forestry rights, fishing rights, and water rights amongst many more, with alienation policies or acts. The nationalist-led apartheid government, as well as the current nationalist ANC-led political party, or policy-based governments, has illegally administered, transferred, and sold the Aboriginal people of South Africa declared colored's land and resource rights. Stay tuned for when we reveal the processes how your land was stolen. Let me explain as to how the national apartheid and the nationalist ANC governments did they do this. Political parties and politicians meticulously crafted elaborate policies from as early as 1910, with recent judgments against legislations based on such political designed policies, declared unconstitutional and illegal. Instead of transferring the colored persons' reserves trust land, its administration, and the substantial trust funds to the colored people, the rightful beneficiaries, the nationalist-led apartheid government used the Missionaries Stations Alienation Act No. 9 of 1911 to maintain the administration for themselves in 1958. The colored people's land and resource rights were alienated from them in the form of farms, cities, towns, Bantustans like Transkei, Venda, and the Ciskei by issuing grants, illegal title deeds, and PTO, permission to occupy. All this land and resource rights, together with trust assets, was taken out of the colored persons' communal reserves trust, without prior consent of the trust beneficiaries, the colored people. The nationalist-led Broederbond signed a treaty with the British in 1945. They did this because they desired to establish the Union State of South Africa as their own, while simultaneously avoiding international war crimes for genocide, by excluding and alienating the colored people from their land and stealing the resources. For their plan to succeed, they had to get participation from the colored people, to keep the international human rights bodies and criminal courts illusioned. To maintain this international illusion, the nationalist-led apartheid politicians founded the National Party during the 1950s, created a tricameral parliament, and within it they designed and legislated the Colored House of Representatives under leadership of politicians Tom Swartz, Sonny Leon, and Alethea Jansen. The House of Representatives was a disaster for the colored people. The colored people were dragged into a westernized political system with unconstitutional and illegal voting processes that allowed a few to decide the fate of many. These representative politicians were mostly apartheid education system indoctrinated academics, such as reverends, teachers, and the peak of educational indoctrination, the title of doctorate, or doctor as proof thereof. With the limitations of these indoctrinations, the few colored politicians in the Colored House of Representatives, together with the nationalist-led apartheid government politicians, forged ahead with their genocide policies and laws, by creating and implementing Act 9 of 1987. This act was to repeal the Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust Act 3 of 1961. But they had one problem. The nationalist-led apartheid government politicians have already made themselves guilty of land rights theft, resource theft, fraud, and genocide, by not transferring the Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust land administration, its resource rights, and the trust funds to the colored people. The nationalist-led apartheid government and their politicians had neither the legality, nor the jurisdiction to create and implement any legislation. These processes was recognized as illegal by international human rights bodies, criminal courts and governments, resulting in pressure via sanctions that forced the nationalist apartheid government politicians by 1988, to apply a new strategic alienation policy, for them to maintain their illegal administration, over the Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust land and the colored people's resource rights. Negotiations with the policy-based ANC politicians began in earnest. A new breed of politics was created, and the ANC and their alliance partner politicians became known as cadres, traditionally natives from East, West, and North Africa, and the historically colonists, primarily from Holland, Britain, and other European countries, became known as the opposition. That there are now political parties with many different names would make no difference, as their purpose is the same. To alienate and steal the Aboriginal people declared colored of South Africa's land and resources with policies and laws. One such policy is the Transformation of Certain Rural Areas Act 94 of 1998, also known as the Trunka Act. This act further alienated the colored people even more of their land and resource rights. The Trunka Act was problematic from the start, for the nationalist apartheid government politicians as well as the rebranded black nationalists. In 2018 the electoral system, and in 2019 the Trunka Act was judged unconstitutional and illegal for the third time. Let us explore why the Trunka is unconstitutional. The Colored Persons Communal Reserves Trust land, resources, and funds, are all protected under Section 25 of the South African Constitution, that the current ANC-led nationalist government and their politicians want to repeal as an impediment. In violation of the Constitution, the Trunka Act was initiated and gazetted, but never signed off by the nationalist ANC-led government's president, also a politician, as he would then be impeached. This did not stop political parties and politicians from implementing the illegal Trunka Act throughout municipalities with devastating results. To summarize the devastation, we only have to look at the 2018 electoral system judgment, and the 2019 Constitutional Court judgment on land tenure on August 20, 2019. The committee was very specifically briefed, by the nationalist ANC-led Government Department of Rural Development and Land Reform, on the implications of the Constitutional Court judgment on the Land Tenure Rights Act, and that it was illegal. They also referred to the damning legacy reports of the previous portfolio committees on agriculture, forestry, fisheries, rural development, and land reform. These legacy reports warned the politicians that what they are doing is illegal and unconstitutional. The politicians ignored the legacy reports. The Concord had found that Section 2(1) of the Land Tenure Rights Act was illegal and constitutionally invalid, because it automatically converted holders of any deed of grant, like the white farmers got under the nationalist apartheid government, or any right of leasehold, as defined the regulations for the administration and control of townships in black areas, under the current ANC-led government, into holders of rights of ownership in violation of women's rights in terms of Section 9(1) of the Constitution. This simply means that the Land Tenure Acts automatically turned lease farms, given to white farmers during the apartheid government, and black townships under the current ANC-led nationalist government that's on the colored person's trust land into title deeds illegally. It ended up at the doors of banks who gave value to these title deeds. This is illegal and the banks should be investigated. One of the biggest concerns and headaches for the ANC-led government politicians around the case is in the Eastern Cape about the constitutionality of the former homeland states of Transkei, Bophuthatswana, Venda, and Ciskei also wanting title deeds to alienate the colored people of their land. It did not make sense to deal with only one part of the legislation that might be unconstitutional, while they may be dealing with a bigger issue. The politicians' legacy report of the former Portfolio Committee on Rural Development and Land Reform indicated that the key focus areas over the 5-year period from 2014 to 2019 included the Restitution of Land Rights Amendment Bill, the Extension of Security of Tenure Amendment Bill, the CPA, Communal Property Association, Amendment Bill, the Restitution of Land Rights Amendment Bill, and the Electronic Deeds Registries Bill. There had also been emphasis on oversight on CPAs and trusts. In other words, politicians failed to uphold the Constitution in all of their own policies, and land was transferred illegally to CPAs and title deeds. Policy-based governments has illegally enacted several pieces of legislation, as part of an elaborate land reform program to alienate the South African Aboriginal people declared colored, of their land and resource rights, as we briefly explained previously, how a few seek to take the South African Aboriginal people declared colored's land and resource rights away. Deeds Registries Act, Act No. 47 of 1937. This act makes provision for the administration of the land registration system and the registration of rights given in land by government politicians, not the owners of the land. It requires that the illegally acquired deeds and documents be prepared and lodged in a deeds registry by a conveyancer or notary public, both employed by the same policy creators. These deeds and documents are subjected to 3 levels of examination by government policy indoctrinated personnel, who scrutinize the contents for accuracy and compliance with common law, case law, and statutory law. Common and statutory law has almost completely been suppressed in favor of politician-written, policy compliance. State Land Disposal Act, Act No. 48 of 1961. The Act makes provision for the disposal of certain state land and to prohibit the acquisition of state land by prescription. This act is totally unconstitutional and illegal as the state or government owns no land in South Africa. They have no right or jurisdiction to dispose of or acquire any land. Sectional Titles Act, Act No. 95 of 1986. The Act makes provision for the division of buildings into sections and common property and for the acquisition of separate ownership in sections coupled with joint ownership in common property. It further regulates the transfer of ownership of sections and the registration of sectional mortgage bonds over, and real rights in such sections. It also makes provision for the establishment of bodies corporate to control common property. This act allowed the apartheid government to give away land and colored persons' trust assets for next to nothing to their own retiring people, but also gave birth to the scourge of estate agents, who continuously positions themselves to sell off colored people's land and assets. Currently they moved from Estate Agency Board, to Property Practitioners Association. This is to position themselves for Act 94 of 1998 as a CPA or association. Land Administration Act, Act No. 2 of 1995. The Act provides for the delegation of powers and the assignment of the administration of laws regarding land matters to the provinces. With this Act, the nationalist ANC-led government gives themselves the power to administer a policy that they have written for themselves, hold on to the administration of the colored persons' communal reserves, trust land and assets. They also used this act to cut South Africa into 9 sections and called it zoning. Land Titles Adjustment Act, Act No. 111 of 1993. The Act regulates the allocation or devolution of certain land in respect of which one or more persons claim ownership, but do not have registered title deeds in respect thereof. With this Act, the nationalist ANC government claimed all the townships where seasonal workers settles on the colored people's land, to then give it to those township dwellers as title deeds. They use the word communal for this, but notable leave out the reference of colored. Instead they want the coloreds to denounce the term of their trust reference, and use the term of reference communal only so it can include all the workers living in townships when the politicians implement this act. Spatial Planning and Land Use Management Act, Act No. 16 of 2013. The Act provides for a framework for spatial planning and land use management in the Republic. The government has no jurisdiction or right to provide any policy framework. Expropriation Act, Act 63 of 1975. The Act provides for the expropriation of land and other property for public and certain other purposes as defined. The ANC-led government politicians does not have the jurisdiction or right to expropriate land in South Africa. Transformation of Certain Rural Areas Act, Act No. 94 of 1998. The Act provides for the transfer of certain land to municipalities and certain other legal entities and for the removal of restrictions on the alienation of land. This Act explains itself. It is illegal, unconstitutional, and rightfully judged so 3 times. The ANC-led government president has not signed this Act. Therefore the truncat in its entirety is a fraudulent document. Property Valuation Act, Act No. 17 of 2014. The Act provides for the establishment of the Office of the Valuer General, for the regulation of the valuation of property that has been identified for land reform as well as property that has been identified for acquisition or disposal by a department. This Act is the link between the South African Aboriginal people declared coloreds land, politicians, estate agents, and banks. We will explore banks and estate agents in another video. So as you can see, policy-based political parties and politicians has everything to lose for themselves if they help you, the South African Aboriginal people declared colored. Their policies that governs them prohibit them from be able to help you. The elaborate illegal laws and policies created by politicians, for themselves to take your land and resource rights, should land them in jail for war crimes. To frustrate you, and to keep the politicians out of the courts and jail, the politicians created for themselves the Protection of Information, or the POPIA Act. Be aware of political parties and politicians and don't let them mislead you any longer. Their intention is not to help you, but to perpetuate dispossessive and oppressive political or policy-based mandates. Join us on the 30th of November 2022 at 11 a.m. on the Grand Parade in Cape Town, to put an end to these parasite movements called political parties, by putting enough information out to our people so they can make informed decisions. See you at the march. For further inquiries, please contact Mr. Joe Ayanchis on 074-283-1030 or Miss Lindy Ann on 068-053-3234.